Hey guys, so here we are in our next set of notes. This is sections 11.1 through 11.6, evolution of population. We have several different key concepts here. We have a population shares a common gene pool. Populations, not individuals, evolve. Natural selection is not the only mechanism through which populations evolve. New species can arise when populations are isolated, and evolution occurs in patterns. Now, if we look at our vocabulary, there's a whole heck of a lot of vocabulary associated with the section. We're not going to take too many notes on each of these things. We will be looking at these more closely, watching some videos this week, next week, and the following week. So don't stress if you don't get it right away. So, essential questions. Just how do populations actually evolve, and how does speciation occur? And we're going to learn what that word of speciation is. Okay, so first things first, genetic variation is stored in a population's gene pool. That is all the available genes in a certain population living in a specific area. And the allele combinations form when the organisms have their offspring. Remember, you get one copy of a gene from mom, one copy of a gene from dad. Those were the alleles. Okay. We can measure how common an allele is in a population using a thing called the allele frequency. So how often, like, do we see more, in my picture, like, do you see more big G's? Do you see more little G's? Do you see a combination? So how common is an actual allele? Microevolution is the observable change in an allele frequency of a single population over time. And I'm going to go back to the example that I gave you guys in class, the example of the green grasshoppers and the brown grasshoppers. Remember, over time, that population can change. The genes, the allele frequencies change based on adaptations. So the green ones were able to hide and camouflage themselves better when there's a lot of grass and a lot of trees. They wouldn't get eaten up as much, so they were passing on the green gene more frequently. Okay. If the grasses and things died off, then the brown gene would become more frequent. And so microevolution is actually the observable change that we see over time. Genetic variation comes from several sources, first of which is mutation. We've talked about that when we talked about DNA. Mutations are just random changes in the DNA of a gene, and those can be passed on to offspring. Also, another huge source of variation is recombination. And so during meiosis, the formations of the sperm and the egg cells, those gametes, remember, they separate independently, segregation, and they form new combinations of alleles in each of the sperm and the egg cells. This is why you do not look absolutely identical to your brothers and sisters unless you are a twin. Okay, we talk about how genes actually move between different populations. We're talking about a thing called the gene flow. And gene flow can occur when individuals join new populations and reproduce. So, you know, like way back before airplanes and before travels and things like that, people stayed where they were. Now with travel, we're introducing new genes, new things into that population all the time. And that happens with our animal populations as well as our plant populations. So gene flow keeps neighboring populations very similar. And low gene flow increases the chance that two populations will evolve into two different species because the genes are staying relatively the same. Okay, the next thing we need to talk about is this thing called genetic drift. Genetic drift is a change in allele frequency due to chance, causing a loss of genetic diversity. And this is usually seen in small populations. So a disease could happen, or an earthquake could happen, or a hurricane, flood, something drastic happens, catastrophic event that leads to a decrease or a loss of diversity in the genes. Okay, and so something can happen drastically reducing the population size, causing this thing to have a bottleneck effect. So a destructive event only leaves a few survivors. Okay, this is the bottleneck effect. Those few survivors only carry specific genes, and only those genes can be passed on. Founding of a small population can lead to something called genetic drift. Okay, it occurs when a few individuals leave an area and start a brand new population somewhere else. Okay, and the founder effect is genetic drift that occurs after the start of a new population. Again, there's not many genes available in that new population. There's only a few individuals, so it's low diversity. Genetic drift has some negative effects on a population that's less likely to have some individuals that can adapt if the environment does change. And also we start to see more harmful versions of the gene being passed on because they're much more, there's not a lot of diversity, so the chances of them actually being seen, especially if it's a recessive thing, is much more likely. Okay, the next thing that happens with evolution, we have sexual selection. Sexual selection occurs when traits increase mating success. And we have two types of sexual selection. Intrasexual, which is competition among males of the same species, okay? And then intersexual, okay? Males will display certain traits to females to try and impress them, with colorations, dances, all sorts of different things, okay? So intersexual is a competition among males to find mates, and the intrasexual is males displaying specific traits to those females to find a mate. Okay, when scientists study evolution, they use models to study a lot of populations. And the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is a type of model, but it describes a model of a population that is not evolving. Okay, so allele frequencies in evolution will not happen if 5 conditions are met. Either you have a very large population and nobody's moving, no genetic drift. You have no immigration or emigration, so nothing moving in or out, so we have no gene flow. No mutations, which would be very crazy because no new alleles then are added to the gene pool. Random mating, so no sexual selection, none are better than others. And no natural selection, all traits aid equally in survival. This would be a hard thing to actually happen because things evolve and change over time because they have to adapt to their environments. So real populations rarely meet all 5 conditions of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and real population data is compared to actually the model. And so we use those models to just study how those populations evolve. Now, we have 5 factors that actually do lead to evolution. We talked about them. We talked about genetic drift, gene flow, mutation, sexual selection, and then last week we talked about natural selection. All of these things can help to lead to evolution. Remember genetic drift? It changes the allele frequencies due to chance alone. Okay. Then we have gene flow, and that's people or animals moving from one population to another. Mutations, our DNA is always changing and provides genetic variation. So DNA changes through either straight up mutations or even through recombination. Next, sexual selection selects for traits that improve mating success. And then we also talked about natural selection. It selects traits that are advantageous for survival. So in nature, we don't see specific individuals evolving, but the whole population evolves over time, and it evolves in response to the changing environments. When things change over time like that, we can have the development of 2 or more species from one existing species, and that results when members of one population become isolated from another, so that they're far away from each other for a long period of time, so they start to adapt and change independently from each other. Okay, so how does speciation work? Speciation is the formation of new species. And how does that work? Well, populations become genetically isolated when there's no gene flow between them due to some type of separation. We're going to talk about those separations. And if you recall, gene flow is the exchange of genes between populations through sexual reproduction. What happens because these populations are separate for so long, we have a thing called reproductive isolation occurring. And this occurs so members of the different populations no longer interbreed. These isolated populations adapt to their own environment, so they're evolving separately from each other. And these genetic differences add up over generations, leading them into new species that no longer can interbreed. Okay, so if you look at this, we've got a bunch of penguins. At some point, we have some ancestor penguins. Some kind of isolations happened where they got separated, and they eventually evolved and adapted to their environment separately, where they no longer interbreed. So we're going to talk a little bit about how populations can become reproductively isolated. Okay, first of which is behavioral isolation. So reproductive isolation is due to differences in mating or courtship behavior. Even though some things can physically interbreed, their behaviors are completely different, so they no longer interbreed. We also have geographic barriers cause a geographic isolation. So things like a mountain range separating two species or two populations, and over time they no longer can get to each other, reach to each other, so they can no longer interbreed. Also, timing of reproductive periods can prevent mating between different populations, and this is called temporal isolation. So a little bit about behavioral isolation. So what happens is some kinds of species of birds impress their mates by different ways, one of which is called a bower-billed bird, and they actually make these little houses. And they try to get the female by building the best houses, and they decorate them and all sorts of things. Geographic isolation, members of populations can become isolated by geographic boundaries like mountains, rivers, or even oceans. Like these populations of the northern spotted owl up here, California, Washington, Oregon. Over here in the desert, we've got the Mexican spotted owl. There's a big mountain range over here in the middle that separates those two groups. And at some point in Earth's history, before those mountains were there, they were one population. But over time, they got split up, evolved separately, and now no longer interbreed. Okay, temporal isolation. We have types of reproduction isolation due to reproducing at different times. Okay, so these frogs all come into mating at different times of the year. So we have the wood frog over here, okay, which his reproductive or mating activity is highest between March and April. And the leopard frog is right after him, and he's more active during April and May. Evolution through natural selection is not random, and the effects of natural selection add up over time, and these small little changes over long periods of time, it leads to different species. Okay. We also have ways that populations do evolve, and we have descriptors for those, one of which is convergent evolution. It describes evolution towards similar traits in unrelated species. Okay, so all of these evolved having fins to swim better, okay, because these were adaptations for the areas that they live in, all right, but they're unrelated, not related species. Divergent evolution describes evolution towards different traits in closely related individuals. So these ones had common ancestors. This common ancestor went on to form the red fox and also the kit fox. Now they look different. They have different colorations, different features, and different adaptations that allow them to survive better in their environments. Again, evolution towards different traits, even though they're closely related. And also, two or more species can actually evolve together. We call this coevolution. So species evolve in response to changes in the other, okay? So this would be like the competition thing. Like think about zebras and lions and African animals, gazelles, and trying to get away from lions. Well, if a lion's trying to attack a pack of gazelles, right? Now, when it's trying to attack, it's going to run fast. The gazelles need to run fast. At some point, the ones that run the fastest are going to survive the best, both sides. Gazelles that can get away and lions that can catch them and eat them. So species can evolve in response to changes in each other. Sometimes they're beneficial things, but they also can be competitive relationships as well. Species do become extinct over time. You know this. Extinction is the elimination of a species from Earth. We have something called background extinction, which occurs continuously. Like all the time, we have things dying off throughout history. Small things throughout history. A species dies off, something comes in to replace it, and so on. So it occurs roughly at the same rate of speciation. And it usually only affects a few species in a small area. And usually this is only caused by local changes in the environment. Now, we do have things called mass extinctions. These are very, very, very rare, but they destroy many species at a global level. And usually these are thought to be caused by catastrophic events like volcanic eruptions, meteors hitting the Earth in the case of the dinosaurs, a whole bunch of different things. And there are at least 5 mass extinctions in the last 600 million years where tons of different species died off. Speciation also occurs in patterns. we have this pattern of punctuated equilibrium, and that exists in the fossil record. There's episodes of all these new species being formed very quickly, and then all of a sudden long periods of little change over time. So many species evolving from one species is called adaptive radiation. And I showed you this picture before when we talked about evolution, on how one species can go on to form a whole bunch of different species just based on the adaptations and the natural selection that happens in those individual populations. Okay, this is it for chapter 11. We're going to go on again to watch some videos that are going to help to describe some of these things. So please let me know if you have any questions.